Good morning, everyone. Today we're going to talk about the Victorian era. In British history, is the period between 1820 and 1914, corresponding roughly but not exactly to the period of Queen Victoria's reign. In the year 1837, Queen Victoria ascended the throne of Great Britain and Ireland and succeeded William IV. She served for a period of 64 years till her death in 1901, and it is one of the longest reigns in the history of England. The period was marked by many important social and historical changes that altered the nation in many ways. The British Empire expanded and it helped Britain become the most powerful country in the world. The formal political system was a constitutional monarchy. It was in practice dominated by aristocratic men. At the national level, government consisted of the monarch and the two houses of parliament, the House of Lords and the House of Commons. During the Victorian period, the House of Commons became the center of government. The House of Lords lost power and the monarchy transformed into a symbol of a nation. While race, religion, and occupation were all meaningful aspects of identity and status, the main organizing principles of Victorian society were gender and class. Victorian gender ideology was stated that men or women were different and meant for different things. Men were physically strong while women were weak. For men, sex was central, and for women, reproduction was central. Men were independent while women were dependent. Men belonged in the public sphere while women belonged in the private sphere. Most Victorian Britons were Christian. The Anglican churches of England, Wales, and Ireland were the state churches of which the monarch was the nominal head, and dominated the religious landscape, even though the majority of Welsh and Irish people were members of other churches. Victorians made and appreciated developments in science. The best known Victorian scientific development is that of the theory of evolution that is credited to Charles Darwin. The dramatic expansion of the empire meant that such goods came to Britain from all over the world. Between 1820 and 1870, the empire grew, shifted its orientation eastward. Much of this expansion involved violence, including the Indian Mutiny, the Morant Bay Rebellion in Jamaica, the Opinion Wars in China, and the Taranaki War in New Zealand. Britain's status as a world political power was bolstered by a strong economy, which grew rapidly between 1820 and 1873. This half-century of growth was followed by an economic depression and by a modest recovery from 1896 until 1914. With the earliest phases of industrialization over about 1840, the British economy expanded. Britain became the richest country in the world, but many people worked long hours in harsh conditions. During the Victorian period, Britain was the cultural capital of the English-speaking world. Victorian performance and print culture were rich and varied, a blend of melodrama, spectacle, and morality. Moreover, Victorian novels were often quite long, with complicated plots and many characters.
As we have seen, many changes occurred during this era, and those changes influenced literature. The main movement was Victorianism. Victorian literature was a clear evidence of the developing period. The characteristics of this movement are the following. Middle class was growing because of industrialization. One important invention was a rotary machine, so it was cheaper to print and produce books. The number of readers increased substantially, and every man and woman could read. Novels were published in 3 volumes and talked about the issues in this society, such as the struggle of people, riot, factory life, triumph or right over wrong, marriage that connected 2 different family classes, and so on. Another characteristic is that some works of this time focus on research and findings about science, such as evolution theory, that is the foundation of evolutionary biology. In that way, religious topics were left behind. Since England was a big empire, that influenced literature as well, because many authors talk about their experiences with other cultures in their work. The last characteristic is that women gained more control about themselves, so they asked for more rights, such as the Matrimonial Causes Act and the Married Women's Property Acts. Even one woman was a big novelist during this time. Nevertheless, she made up a name, so no one knew the writer was her. Realism was another movement that coincided with Victorianism. This movement took reality as it was. Objectivity was the most important characteristic of it. Writers could not mention their opinions. We can see this characteristic in many novels because it shows the reality of the society of this time. However, Victorianism was more important in the kingdom than realism. There were two significant genres during the Victorian era. The first one is poetry. Poetry was at first influenced by Romanticism, and it was a bridge between that movement and modernism. The main characteristic of poetry is a reclaiming of the past, especially of classic and medieval literature. The Victorians loved the heroic stories of knights as well. Long narrative poems were used during this time alongside dramatic monologues. Some topics mentioned in Victorian poems were realism, skepticism, and excesses of responsibility. Novel is the most significant genre of Victorianism. Poetry was no longer the popular one, but novel. The reason was a middle class could afford some novels just for 1 penny, because some works were published in newspapers in parts, so it made the readers anxious to see what would happen next and buy the newspaper. The characteristics of it are mostly the novels showed reality like a mirror of the world. The main topics were the struggle of men and the change in society. The novels just report facts. The truth about the character was told, the good and the bad. The language was simple and direct, and the emphasis was on here and now. Writers also included many characters in their work. However, there were some subgenres such as fiction and fantasy. The most popular detective, Sherlock Holmes, was born during this era.
Now we are going to present 6 exponents of the time, novelists and poets. We're going to start with Charles Dickens. Charles Dickens is one of the most popular writers in English. In particular, his novels are brimming with colorful and eccentric characters, which leave a lasting impression. He was a keen and observant writer, incorporating the characters that he met and interacted with in his life, adding a touch of fantasy and exaggeration with his vivid descriptive style. There are various themes which run throughout his writings, which often reflect various degrees of his own life stories. Dickens loved the rags to riches stories, exemplified by Oliver Twist and David Copperfield. He frequently highlighted the worst excesses and social evils of Victorian society, and highlighted his views in a wonderfully witty way. His novels were very popular then and continue to be so even today. Charles Dickens loved the Gothic romance of the 18th century. His writing style was florid, poetic, and it had a powerful comic touch. Charles Dickens was famous for his novels, which portrayed the difficult life of the working class and his characters. The characters like Tiny Tim, Oliver Twist, Pip, David Copperfield, and many others were so beautifully portrayed as if they really existed. The next one is Thomas Hardy. Thomas Hardy was the greatest novelist of this generation. His first published novel, Desperate Remedies, appeared in 1871 and was followed by 13 more before he abandoned prose to publish only poetry. Thomas Hardy, quite a known name under this literary firmament, this person was all about composing exceptional Victorian fictions and checking out ideas that were out of the box and fleshing out poetries and stories out of them. The stories he did compose are really lucid and easily approachable as well. When it comes to genre, it is classical in the wider and broader sense, but he used to put twists into every traditional writing convention, and that is what makes this author so special until today. The Bronte sisters, now considered as the pioneers of feminist literature, Charlotte Emily and Anne Bronte, were sisters and writers of literary classics as Jane Eyre, Wuthering Heights, and The Tenant of Wildfell Hall. The Brontes published under the pseudonyms of Currer, Ellis, and Acton Bell, pretended to be three brothers instead of three sisters because they felt that their writing would not be taken seriously if anyone knew they were women. All of their work contains heavy Gothic influences, which, as an exaggerated form of Romanticism, was very popular during the Victorian era. Their pieces' themes were very unusual, and in many ways the Brontes were forerunners of feminism. Now, let's talk about Alfred Lord Tennyson. He was a popular poet of the Victorian age. Even his contemporaries had considered him in those days to be the greatest poet of the Victorian period. Alfred was very much influenced by the works of great poets like John Keats, who was famous as a romantic poet. His work was believed to have had a significant impact on Alfred's imagination and writing skills. Alfred was inspired by classical mythology, and same was reflected in his work. In the major poems of his middle period, Tennyson combined the larger scale required by his new ambitions with his original gift for the brief lyrics by building long poems out of short ones. Tennyson became poet laureate in 1850 and wrote some apt and memorable poems on patriotic themes. Finally, let's talk about Robert Browning and Elizabeth Barrett Browning. Although the early parts of Robert Browning's creative life was spent in comparative obscurity, he has come to be regarded as one of the most important English poets of the Victorian period. Browning found his individual modern voice in 1842 with the volume Dramatic Lyrics. As the title suggests, it was a collection of dramatic monologues. The monologues make clear the radical originality of Browning's new manner. They involve the reader in sympathetic identification with the interior processes of criminal or unconventional minds, requiring active rather than merely passive engagement in the processes of moral judgment and self-discovery. His approach to dramatic monologue influenced countless poets for almost a century. In 1848, Browning married Elizabeth Barrett. Though now remembered chiefly for her love poems, she was in her own lifetime far better known than her husband. Her poems established her as a leading poet of the age. A musical instrument written in 1872 is one of the century's most memorable expressions of the difficulty of the poet's role. Now let's see some representative pieces of the Victorian age, such as Oliver Twist, Jane Eyre, and Ulysses. Let's start with Oliver Twist. It was Charles Dickens' second novel. The other name of the Oliver Twist is The Parish Boy's Progress. It was first published as a serial in between 1837 to 1839. This story is all about Oliver Twist, who is an orphan and born in a workhouse. He is then sold into an apprenticeship with an undertaker. Oliver then meets the Artful Dodger after he escapes to London. Artful Dodger is a member of a gang of juvenile pickpockets, which is led by Fagin, who is an elderly criminal. This novel of Dickens exposes the cruel treatment of the many orphans in London in the mid-19th century. He also satirizes the child labor, the enrollment of children as criminals, and the existence of street children. The second representative piece of the Victorian age is Jane Eyre. Jane is an unconventional heroine, an independent and self-reliant woman who overcomes both adversity and societal norms. The novel also notably blended diverse genres. Jane's choice between sexual need and ethical duty belongs very firmly to the mode of moral realism. However, her close escape from Bigamous marriage and the fiery death of Bertha are part of the Gothic tradition. Gothic overtones run throughout this classic romantic novel, which some consider the finest by all the Bronte sisters. And the last one is Ulysses. The main theme of this poem is growing old. The name refers to the classic myth of Ulysses that returned from the Trojan War. One of the most exciting features of this literary work is the use of the dramatic monologue that became quite a popular thing in Victorian poetry. Lord Tennyson is known to be one of the first to use it in his poetry. The lyrical hero of the poem remembers the old days of glory and experiences of the battles and adventures that are now only memory. Thank you so much for listening. We hope you enjoy it.